We're starting this new sermon series today in November, a month of giving thanks. And we're going to talk today on this Communion Sunday about giving thanks for our daily bread. From Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. For I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I've reached that age and stage in life when remembering things is not as simple as it used to be. I'll just offer one simple example. A few years ago, my wife could call me, Bobby, and could call me and say, "Don, on the way home, why don't you stop by the grocery store, pick up some ground meat and some hamburger buns, and we'll grill hamburgers tonight?" And I said, "Okay." And I did, and we did. These days, she'll call me, it'll go like this: "Don, why don't you, on the way home, stop by the grocery store, pick up some buns and hamburger meat, and we'll grill hamburgers tonight?" And I'll say, "No problem." And then she will say, "Don, pull out your 3x5 card that you keep in your pocket, make a note." I'll say, "Okay." And then she'll say, "That fancy iPhone that you've got, put a reminder in your iPhone with an alarm." And I'll say, "Okay." And even then, we might have grilled hamburgers that night, or we might have Whataburgers. Remembering stuff is just not as easy as it used to be. Now, when we turn to this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, a church which he founded, we discover that he was very upset with them. Some of you have studied Paul's first letter to the Corinthians in a Bible study or in Sunday school, and so you know that in spite of that beautiful 13th chapter about love, faith, hope, and love, that wonderful, beautiful, romantic language about love, you know that when you look at the whole letter to the Corinthians, he literally chews them out. He is not happy. He set up the church to worship in certain ways. He set up the way in which they would be in community with one another. And now he has learned that they are doing everything wrong. And so he goes right down the list, just pretty much straightening them out. And it is no nonsense. And when you get to the section right before what we read a moment ago, he starts talking to them about the way in which they have been celebrating the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion. And he doesn't like it. He doesn't like it at all. We don't have time to talk about what they were doing wrong this morning, except to say to you that they were celebrating the Lord's Supper in such a way that it was more about them than it was about Jesus. And so he goes down his list, correcting them, giving them some answers about how it should be as opposed to the way they were doing it. And then he illustrates it with the passage that we read a moment ago, starting with verse 23. He says, "Remember how it was that the Lord Jesus originally celebrated the Lord's Supper. He took up the bread and he blessed it and he said, 'Now whenever you eat of this bread, do so in remembrance of me.' And then he took the cup and he poured the cup and he said, 'Whenever you drink of this cup, do so in remembrance of me.'" And so clearly this issue of memory was important to Jesus. He wanted them, when they celebrated the Lord's Supper, to remember Jesus. To remember that it was Jesus who had lived for them, died for them, been resurrected for them. "Do this in remembrance of me." There's just one problem with that. Nowhere else in the Bible do we find any evidence that Jesus actually said that during the Lord's Supper. "Do this in remembrance of me." You can check this out when you go home. Look up Mark, Matthew, Luke. Let's take Mark, for instance. Mark but almost all scholars believe that Mark was the very earliest gospel. And when you read about the celebration of the Lord's Supper at the end of the life of Jesus in Mark, he picks up the cup, he blesses it. He picks up the bread, he blesses it. He does not say, "Do this in remembrance of me." Neither does he do so in Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke both. Mark was the earliest gospel. Matthew and Luke both had Mark sitting in front of them when they wrote their gospels. That's why they share so much material in common. And none of the three of them ever quote Jesus as saying, "Do this in remembrance of me." And so it leaves a mystery. What really happened at that Lord's Supper? Is it possible that at the original Lord's Supper, Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," and that had been passed on to Paul and he had it right, and for some reason Mark dropped that from his recounting of the Lord's Supper? Or is it possible that it never happened, but Paul added it for a certain reason? It's one of those neat little biblical mysteries. We don't know the answer. We don't know the answer. But what we do know is that for Paul, those words were extremely important. Paul believed with all of his might, with great fervor, he believed that when you go to the table and you break the bread and you lift the cup, that when Jesus did it, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me," and that we should as well, and we do. For Paul, this issue of remembering Jesus during the supper, that Jesus lived for us, died for us, rose for us, was of extreme importance. You might be one of those people who grew up in a small Texas town, and when you were 12 or 13 or 14 years old, you went with your girlfriends to the revival at the Baptist church. Maybe you went to the Methodist church or the Disciples of Christ church, but your friend said, "Let's go to the revival. They got a great preacher at the Baptist church." And so on Tuesday night, you went to the revival at the Baptist church. And this guy was a really, really good preacher. And as things were winding down at the end of the service, he came down and you sang some really moving music. And he opened the altar and he said, "The invitation is here. It's now for you to come down and give your life to Jesus." And there for a few minutes, it was as if he was talking directly to you and to your friends. And suddenly the tears started flowing, and soon you found yourself moving with the rest of the teenagers to the altar. And there you went to your knees and you gave your life to Jesus. And you knew that that was the most important thing that had ever happened to you in your life up until that moment. When you went home, you told your mother what happened. And you said, "This is a moment that I won't ever forget." But you did. Life got busy. You went to college. Lots of distractions in life. And after a few years, that memory receded in your mind and consciousness to the point that you really never thought about it anymore at all. Or maybe it happened in the Methodist way. We have lots of grown adults in this church who grew up in this church, in this youth group, and maybe this is the way it happened to you. You went on our Appa mission trip, and you found yourself up on top of a roof nailing in shingles. And that night, after you were through and the sun was setting, you went down and you sat and talked with the little lady who owned that home, and the tears started flowing down her cheeks, and she turned to you and she said, "You are a gift from God." And suddenly the light came on. After all of those years of going to Sunday school and studying about Jesus, suddenly you understood it, that Jesus is about serving and loving others. And in that moment, your life was changed. And you thought, "This is a moment that I won't ever forget." Or maybe it happened at Bridgeport Camp. Bridgeport Camp is still there. A lot of you went to Bridgeport Camp. There you were on the last night of youth camp at Bridgeport. There was a fire. And the cross, that old wooden cross, is still there, looming in front of you on the point the panorama of Lake Bridgeport in front of you. And someone was playing a guitar. And you were singing Kumbaya. And that cute little blonde girl was sitting next to you. She had had your heart going pitter-patter all week long, and now here she was sitting next to you. And it was an emotional moment. And you gave your life to Jesus. And you said, this is a moment I won't ever forget. But you did. Or maybe for you it happened much, much later in life. Maybe it was that moment when they said, come into this labor and delivery room. And the doctors and the nurses said, it's just about time. And then came that moment when your baby came into the world. And you looked down into the eyes and face of that baby. And in that moment you knew for sure something that you had never, ever really understood in life. That God is creator. That God is at the center of the universe, the heart and soul and spirit of the universe. And in that moment you knew that God not only made that baby, but that God made that baby's mother and gave her to you. And that God made you. And suddenly you understood what had been missing in your life all those years. That it all belongs to God. And you said in this moment, I won't ever forget what happened here. Until a few years later, you found yourself sitting at your desk looking at a computer screen. And you realized that your heart was going pitter-patter more over the gyrations of the Dow Jones Industrial Average than over what happened to you at Bridgeport Lake or in that labor and delivery room. And so Paul knew exactly what he was talking about when he said, I want you to gather as the church gathered in community, and I want you to come to this life-changing meal. And when you break this bread, do so in remembrance of me. When you lift this cup, may you do so in remembrance of me. And so today, when you come to this table that we share, let these words have power in your life. May you come to this place and know that the one who spreads this banquet in front of you is the one who lived for you, died for you, rose for you. But one more thing, and it's only in my old age when I can't remember things that I've come to understand this. I think Paul wanted this meal to be more than even that for you and me. I think Paul wanted this meal to be a symbolic meal, a sacrament that reminds us of the sacrament of life itself. Just like those old Hebrews out in the wilderness, the manna coming from heaven one day at a time. Paul wanted us to remember Jesus every single day. Paul wanted us to remember Jesus in our daily bread. Paul understood that our daily bread and the breath of life itself is a sacramental moment. And so this is the way I think of it. Paul said, tomorrow when you rise and you take your daily bread and you receive your cup, do so in remembrance of Jesus. For me, that would be a piece of toast and 2 pieces of bacon and a cup of coffee. And I really do believe that Paul intended that to be a sacramental moment for each of us every single day. As we break the bread and take the cup, we say, today we receive the gift of life from God who's at the center of the universe. In this moment, with the breath I take in this moment, I remember Jesus lived and rose for me. On this day, dear God, I give you thanks for my daily bread.